Colorado Territory, 1873. Pearl Kearney stared at her father with disbelief, the letter in her hand trembling like aspen leaves in an autumn wind. The parlor of their Denver home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison cell where her sentence had just been delivered. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At 22 years old, Pearl had imagined many futures for herself, but none like this. "You wish to send me away, to some stranger in the mountains." Her father, Judge Thomas Kearney, maintained his stoic expression, hands clasped behind his back as he stood before the fireplace. The dancing flames cast long shadows across his weathered face, deepening the lines of determination etched there. "It is already arranged, Pearl. After 2 years of marriage and no child to show for it, Winston's family has made their position clear. The annulment papers were filed this morning." Pearl's blue eyes filled with tears, and she tucked a strand of her honey-blonde hair behind her ear. The weight of her failure pressed down on her shoulders. 2 years of marriage to Winston Hargrove, the son of Denver's wealthiest banker, had ended not with love but with shame. Barren. The word had been whispered behind fans at social gatherings, murmured by servants when they thought she couldn't hear. "And what of my wishes?" she asked, raising her chin despite the tears threatening to spill. "Am I to have no say in my own future?" Her mother, Elizabeth, seated primly on the edge of the settee, finally spoke. "Pearl, darling, you must understand our position. Your father's appointment to the Territorial Supreme Court has placed us in the public eye. The scandal of an annulment is bad enough without you remaining here as a reminder." "A reminder of what, mother?" "That I am human, that my body has failed to perform as expected." The bitterness in her voice surprised even herself. Her father's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Young is a respectable man, rough around the edges perhaps, but he owns a considerable parcel of land near the San Juan Mountains. He requires a wife to help manage his holdings, and you require a fresh start away from society's cruel judgments." Pearl looked down at the letter again, reading the terse acceptance from a man she had never met. Reed Young, a mountain man who had agreed to take a barren city woman as his wife. The arrangement felt medieval, as if she were being traded like cattle. "And if I refuse?" Her father's eyes hardened again. "Then you shall make your way in the world without the Kearney name or fortune to support you. I cannot have my position compromised by your situation." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. In Denver society, a barren woman was considered less than whole. Winston's family had made that abundantly clear when they'd cited her failure to fulfill her wifely duties in the annulment papers. Pearl stood smoothing the folds of her cornflower blue dress. "When am I expected to depart?" "The day after tomorrow. Mr. Abernathy will escort you to Durango, where Mr. Young will meet you." 2 days. Just 2 days to leave behind everything she had ever known. As Pearl climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night, a strange calm settled over her. Perhaps there was freedom to be found in disgrace. After all, what more could she possibly lose? She believed that a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, and having failed at that, she was worthless. This false belief had taken root during her marriage to Winston, fertilized by his family's disapproval and her own society's cruel judgments. The following day passed in a blur of packing and tearful goodbyes to the few friends who dared visit the house of the disgraced Mrs. Hargrove, soon to be Miss Kearney again, and shortly after, Mrs. Young. The name felt foreign on her tongue when she practiced saying it alone in her room. As dawn broke on the day of her departure, Pearl stood before her mirror one last time. She had chosen a practical traveling dress of deep green wool, her honey-blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a matching bonnet. At 22, her face still held the softness of youth, though the past 2 years had etched fine lines of worry around her blue eyes. "You are more than your womb," she whispered to her reflection, the words feeling both rebellious and hollow. The journey west was long and uncomfortable. Mr. Abernathy, her father's clerk, barely spoke 10 words to her over 3 days of travel by train and then stagecoach. When they finally arrived in Durango, Pearl's body ached from the constant jostling, and her spirit felt just as bruised. The frontier town bustled with activity, miners, traders, and settlers creating a tapestry of frontier life that was entirely foreign to Pearl's Denver upbringing. As she stepped down from the stagecoach, her legs wobbling from the journey, she scanned the crowd for the stranger who was to be her husband, Mrs. Hargrove. Pearl turned toward the deep voice, correcting him before she could stop herself. "It's Miss Kearney now." The man who stood before her was not at all what she had expected. Her father had described Reed Young as a mountain man, conjuring images of a grizzled, bearded giant in Pearl's imagination. Instead, she found herself looking up at a tall, broad-shouldered young man who couldn't have been more than 26 years old. His face was tanned from outdoor life but remarkably handsome, with a strong jaw covered in light stubble rather than the wild beard she'd anticipated. His eyes, a striking shade of green, assessed her with equal curiosity. He wore simple but clean clothing, a buckskin jacket over a cotton shirt, durable trousers and boots that had clearly seen many miles. "Reed Young," he said, extending a calloused hand toward her. When she hesitated, he awkwardly withdrew it. "I've got a wagon waiting. It's a full day's journey to the homestead from here." Pearl nodded, suddenly aware of how far she was from everything familiar. "I'm ready." Mr. Abernathy handed over the paperwork that officially transferred Pearl from her father's responsibility to Reed Young's care, along with a small pouch that Pearl suspected contained payment for taking her off their hands. The indignity of it burned in her chest. Reed loaded her trunks into a sturdy wagon without comment. When he offered his hand to help her up to the seat, she accepted it this time, noting the gentle strength in his grip despite the roughness of his skin. As they pulled away from Durango, leaving behind the last vestige of civilized life Pearl had known, she felt a curious mixture of terror and liberation. The mountains rose before them, majestic and indifferent to human concerns, while behind her lay the ashes of her former life. "I suppose we should discuss terms," she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. Reed glanced at her, the reins held loosely in his capable hands. "Terms of our arrangement. My father indicated you required a wife to help manage your property. I should inform you that while I can cook adequately and keep house, I have little experience with frontier living." A faint smile touched his lips. "I figured as much from your father's letter." And Pearl swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "I should confirm that you're aware of my condition." His brow furrowed. "Condition?" "My inability to bear children." The words came out stiff and formal, as if she were discussing a business transaction rather than the most intimate failure of her life. Reed's eyes returned to the trail ahead, his expression unreadable. "Judge Kearney mentioned you were previously married. He didn't elaborate on the details." Pearl's hands twisted in her lap. "The marriage was annulled on grounds of my barrenness." The wagon hit a rut in the road, jostling them both. Reed steadied the horses before responding. "Out here, folks don't put much stock in city doctors' pronouncements. I've seen women declared barren go on to have half a dozen children once they're away from corsets and city air." His words, spoken without judgment or pity, stirred something in Pearl, a dangerous flicker of hope that she immediately tamped down. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Nevertheless," she said, "I think it only fair you understand what you're getting." Reed's gaze met hers, direct and assessing. "What I'm getting is a partner, Miss Kearney. Someone to share the work and the rewards of the land. Children would be welcome, but they're not why I agreed to this match." "Then why did you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He returned his attention to the trail, guiding the horses around a sharp bend. "Living alone in the mountains gives a man too much time with his own thoughts, and the land I'm working, it's good land, deserves more than one person's dream to build on it." As the wagon climbed higher into the mountains, Pearl felt a strange sense that she was ascending into a different life entirely. The air grew cooler and clearer, the forest denser. Occasionally, Reed would point out landmarks or name the mountains that surrounded them, his voice revealing a deep connection to this wild place. By late afternoon, Pearl's back ached from the rough journey, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Just as she was about to ask how much further they had to travel, the wagon rounded a bend and Reed announced, "There it is, home." Before them, a valley opened up, cradled by mountains on 3 sides and bordered by a rushing river on the 4th. In the center stood a substantial log cabin, far larger and more refined than Pearl had expected. with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Beyond it stretched fenced pastures where horses grazed and further still, fields that had been cleared and cultivated. "It's beautiful," Pearl said softly, genuine appreciation in her voice. Reed's expression softened with pride. "Been working this land for 4 years now, started with just the small cabin there." He pointed to a structure near the main house that now appeared to be a workshop. "Built the house proper last year." As they approached, Pearl noticed other outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a chicken coop. This was no rough mountain camp but a working homestead, thoughtfully planned and well-maintained. Reed brought the wagon to a stop before the house and jumped down, coming around to offer his hand to Pearl. As she descended, her legs nearly buckled beneath her from the long journey. "Let me show you inside," he said. "We can bring your things in after you've rested a bit." The interior of the cabin surprised Pearl even more than its exterior. The main room was spacious, with polished wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Simple but well-crafted furniture filled the space, a dining table with chairs, a settee before the hearth, and bookshelves that held more volumes than she would have expected from a frontier man. "You built all this?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a side table. Reed nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks at her obvious admiration. "Winter nights are long. Gives a man time to work on such things." He showed her through the rest of the house, the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, the pantry stocked with preserved foods, and upstairs 3 bedrooms. One was clearly Reed's, with a large bed and simple furnishings. Another appeared set up as a study or office. The third, "This would be your room," Reed said, standing in the doorway of a space that had been prepared with a bed, dresser, and washstand. A colorful quilt covered the bed and curtains framed the window that overlooked the valley. "My room," Pearl repeated, confused. Reed shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "I thought, that is, I didn't want to presume. The judge said we'd be married by the circuit preacher when he comes through next month, but until then." Understanding dawned on Pearl. "You mean to give me my own space?" "Unless you'd rather not," he added quickly. "I just thought you might want time to adjust." The consideration behind this gesture, so unexpected and so contrary to what she had steeled herself for, left Pearl momentarily speechless. In Denver, she would have already been expected to fulfill her wifely duties, regardless of personal comfort. "Thank you," she said finally. "That's very thoughtful." Relief crossed Reed's features. "I'll bring your trunks up, then start on supper. You must be tired from the journey." Left alone in her new room, Pearl sank onto the bed, the events of the past days catching up to her at last. She was hundreds of miles from everything familiar, in the home of a man she had just met, preparing to begin a life she had never imagined for herself. And yet, the mountain man her parents had sent her to in disgrace had shown more consideration in their brief acquaintance than Winston had in 2 years of marriage. It was a small mercy in a situation that offered few. That night, after a simple but satisfying meal of venison stew and fresh bread that Reed had prepared, Pearl sat before the fire, watching the flames dance as her new companion cleared the dishes. "You cook very well," she observed. "I hadn't expected that." Reed glanced over his shoulder with a slight smile. "A man living alone either learns to cook or eats poorly. I chose the former." "Tomorrow I shall take over the kitchen duties," Pearl said. "It seems only fair, as you've done so much already." He nodded, accepting her offer without argument. When he joined her by the fire, sitting in a chair across from hers, Pearl found herself studying him more openly. In the firelight, his features were softer, the green of his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "How did you come to be here?" she asked. "In this particular valley, I mean." Reed leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. "I came west after the war, served in the Union Army, 17th Infantry. Afterward, home didn't feel like home anymore." "You fought in the war?" Pearl hadn't considered that possibility. He seemed too young. "Enlisted in '63 when I was 16, lied about my age." A shadow crossed his face. "Saw enough in those 2 years to last a lifetime." Pearl could only imagine what horrors a 16-year-old boy had witnessed on the battlefields. "Is that why you sought solitude in the mountains?" "Partly," he acknowledged. But it was more that I wanted to build something new, something that wasn't shaped by all that destruction. He gestured toward the window where the valley lay in darkness beyond. Found this place by accident, really. Got separated from a hunting party during a snowstorm and took shelter in a cave up on the ridge. When the storm cleared, I looked down and saw this valley. Something about it just felt right. The way he spoke of the land with reverence and connection stirred something in Pearl. Her own life had been defined by social obligations and expectations, with little room for such passion, and you've been here ever since. Reed nodded, staked my claim, built the first cabin, started clearing fields. First couple of years were hard but worth it. He paused, studying her. What about you? Your father's letter mentioned Denver society but not much else. Pearl hesitated, unsure how much to reveal of her humiliation. There's little to tell. I was raised to be a proper lady, married at 20 to a banker's son, and failed at the one thing expected of me. Having children isn't the only measure of a person's worth, Reed said quietly. The simple statement, delivered without preachment or condescension, brought unexpected tears to Pearl's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to appear weak on her first night in this new place. Society would disagree with you, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Then society is wrong, he stood, stretching. It's getting late and you've had a long journey. I'll be up at dawn, but you're welcome to rest as long as you need. As Pearl prepared for bed in her new room, she found herself replaying their conversation. Reed Young was nothing like what she had expected, neither the grizzled mountain man of her fears nor the harsh taskmaster her father had implied. Instead, he was something far more dangerous to her carefully constructed defenses. A kind man who saw her as more than her failure. Sleep came more easily than she had anticipated, her exhaustion overwhelming the strangeness of her surroundings. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through her window, and the sounds of activity drifted up from below. Pearl dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, a sky-blue cotton with minimal embellishments, and made her way downstairs. She found Reed returning from what appeared to be morning chores, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Surprisingly so," she admitted. "I hope I haven't delayed your day too much by sleeping late." He shook his head, already tended the animals and checked the fence line. "There's coffee on the stove and eggs from the chickens if you're hungry." Pearl found the kitchen neat and organized, with everything she needed easily at hand. As she prepared a simple breakfast for herself, she felt Reed watching her from the doorway. "Would you like to see the rest of the homestead today?" he asked. "Might help you get your bearings." "I would like that very much," Pearl replied, surprised by her own eagerness. After breakfast, Reed guided Pearl around his property, showing her the barn where he kept 2 milk cows and several horses, the chicken coop with its dozen laying hens, and the workshop where he crafted furniture during the winter months. Beyond these were fields where he grew wheat and corn, and pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished alone," Pearl said as they walked along the river that formed the eastern boundary of the property. "I had no idea it would be so established." Reed skipped a stone across the river's surface, watching it bounce 4 times before sinking. "Didn't start out this way. First winter I nearly starved. Second winter I was better prepared but got caught in a blizzard and lost 2 toes to frostbite." He gestured to his left foot with a wry smile. "Learning comes at a price out here." Pearl's eyes widened at this casual mention of hardship. "Yet you stayed." "The land's worth the struggle." He looked around at the mountains that embraced them. "Besides, where else would I find a view like this?" As they continued their tour, Pearl began to understand why Reed had felt so drawn to this place. Despite the isolation, there was a serenity here that Denver, with all its social pretensions, had never offered. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Pearl took over the household duties, cooking, cleaning, and tending the kitchen garden that Reed had started but admitted needed a woman's touch. Reed handled the livestock, the fields, and the endless maintenance that a mountain homestead required. They shared meals and evening conversations by the fire, gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Pearl learned that Reed had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him the value of creating rather than destroying. Reed discovered that Pearl had a talent for drawing, having studied with a French artist in Denver before her marriage. "You should draw the valley," he suggested one evening as Pearl sketched him by firelight, her fingers smudged with charcoal. "Capture it in different seasons." "I'd like that," she said, pleased by his interest in her modest talent. Winston had dismissed her art as a frivolous pastime, unworthy of a banker's wife. As the days passed, Pearl found herself thinking less and less about her life in Denver. The fresh mountain air and physical work brought color to her cheeks and strength to her body that corsets and parlor life had suppressed. She stopped pinning her honey blonde hair quite so severely, allowing it to hang in a simple braid down her back as she worked. Reed noticed the changes in her, his green eyes following her movements with increasing frequency. Their hands would brush when passing dishes at dinner, lingering a moment longer than necessary. The space between them seemed charged with an awareness that neither was ready to acknowledge. One morning, as Pearl gathered eggs from the henhouse, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she saw 3 riders approaching the cabin. Reed emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth as he went to meet them. Pearl approached cautiously, unused to visitors after nearly a month of isolation. As she drew closer, she recognized the lead rider as a man in clerical garb, the circuit preacher her father had mentioned. "Mr. Young," the preacher called out, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle. "Good to see you again." "Reverend Miller," Reed greeted him, shaking his hand. "Wasn't expecting you for another week or so. Weather's turning early in the high passes, thought it best to make my rounds while traveling is still good." The Reverend's eyes found Pearl, standing uncertainly nearby. "And this must be the young lady Judge Kearney wrote about." Reed gestured for Pearl to join them. "Pearl, this is Reverend Miller, Reverend Miss Pearl Kearney." The older man bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Miss Kearney. I understand I'm to perform a wedding ceremony." The directness of his question brought color to Pearl's cheeks. She glanced at Reed, who looked equally caught off guard by the preacher's timing. "We, weren't expecting you quite yet," Reed said, running a hand through his hair. "Haven't had time to prepare properly." "Nonsense," said one of the Reverend's companions, a woman in her 50s with a kind face. "A wedding needs only a willing bride and groom, God's blessing, and witnesses. We have all 4 right here." Pearl felt panic rising in her chest. While she had known this day was coming, the reality of marrying a man she had known for barely a month suddenly felt overwhelming. Reed seemed to sense her distress. "Perhaps you'd like some time to consider, Pearl," the Reverend could return. "He can't return," the other rider, a young man who looked to be the Reverend's assistant, interrupted. "We're heading to the mining camps after this, then south before the snow flies. Could be spring before we're back this way." The Reverend's wife patted Pearl's arm sympathetically. "I know it's sudden, dear, but these are the realities of frontier life. Windows of opportunity are brief." Pearl looked at Reed, searching his face for some indication of his thoughts. His expression was carefully neutral, leaving the decision entirely to her. "May I speak with Mr. Young privately?" she asked. The Reverend nodded. "Of course. Martha and I could use some refreshment after our ride if you don't mind." While the visitors rested and took coffee in the cabin, Pearl led Reed to the riverbank where they had walked on her first day at the homestead. "I don't know what to do," she admitted once they were alone. "This is happening so much faster than I expected." Reed picked up a stone and turned it over in his hands. "We don't have to go through with it today. I can make your excuses to the Reverend." "And then what?" "I remain here unmarried until spring. The impropriety of such an arrangement would scandalize even frontier society." "You could return to Denver," Reed suggested quietly, though something in his voice suggested he didn't favor this option. Pearl shook her head firmly. "There's nothing for me there except judgment and pity." Reed tossed the stone into the river, watching the ripples spread outward. "Then we're left with the obvious choice, unless." "Unless?" He turned to face her fully, his green eyes serious. "Unless you find the prospect of marrying me too disagreeable, I wouldn't hold you to an arrangement you can't abide." Pearl studied his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the small scar near his left eyebrow, the kindness in his eyes that had never wavered since her arrival. In the weeks they had spent together, he had shown her nothing but respect and consideration. "It's not disagreeable," she said softly. "It's just unexpected. I thought we would have more time to become acquainted." A smile tugged at the corner of Reed's mouth. "We'll have a lifetime for that if you're willing." The simple statement, offered without pressure or demand, made Pearl's decision surprisingly easy. "Then I suppose we should go back and tell the Reverend we're ready." The ceremony took place that afternoon on the porch of the cabin, with the valley spread out below them and the mountains standing witness. Pearl wore her best dress, a sage green silk that brought out the blue of her eyes, and Reed had changed into a clean shirt and his least-worn trousers. The Reverend's words were traditional but heartfelt, speaking of partnership and mutual support rather than the obedience and subjugation Pearl had heard emphasized at Denver weddings. When it came time to exchange vows, Pearl was surprised by the steadiness in her voice as she promised to stand by Reed through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Reed's hands were warm around hers as he made his own promises, his green eyes never leaving her face. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Reed hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a gentle, almost questioning kiss on Pearl's lips. It was her first kiss since Winston, and the contrast could not have been more stark. Where Winston's kisses had been perfunctory at best, Reed's held a tentative sweetness that made Pearl's heart flutter unexpectedly. The Reverend and his companions stayed only long enough to share a wedding supper before continuing on their journey, promising to return in the spring to check on the newlyweds. As the sun set over the mountains, Pearl found herself alone with her husband, the word still strange in her mind when applied to Reed. An awkward silence fell between them as they cleared away the remains of the meal. The question of sleeping arrangements hung unspoken in the air. "I'll take the small bedroom," Reed said finally, breaking the tension, "until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Pearl's chest. "You don't have to give up your room. I want you to feel safe here, Pearl," he said simply, "not rushed or pressured." That night, lying in what was now officially her marriage bed, Pearl stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. Somewhere in the house, her husband slept alone, honoring her unspoken need for time and space. The realization brought tears to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a gratitude she hadn't expected to feel in this arranged marriage. As autumn progressed, the mountains blazed with color before fading to the muted tones of early winter. Pearl and Reed continued their separate sleeping arrangements, though their days were filled with shared work and increasing closeness. Reed taught Pearl to ride properly, to shoot a rifle for protection, and to identify edible plants in the forest surrounding their home. Pearl introduced refinements to their living space: curtains made from fabric she had brought from Denver, arrangements of dried wildflowers, and small touches that transformed the cabin into a true home. Their evenings were spent reading aloud from Reed's surprisingly extensive library, playing chess, or simply talking by the fire. Pearl learned more about Reed's experiences during the war, the horror and destruction he had witnessed as a boy soldier, and his determination afterward to create rather than destroy. "That's why I build furniture," he explained one night as they sat before the hearth, a quilt shared across their laps against the growing chill. "Every piece is an act of creation to balance what I was part of during those years." Pearl rested her hand on his arm, feeling the strength beneath the fabric of his shirt. "You've created something remarkable here, Reed. This entire homestead is a testament to life, not death." In such moments, the connection between them deepened, transcending the arrangement that had brought them together. Pearl found herself watching Reed as he worked, admiring the sureness of his movements and the quiet competence he brought to every task. The first snow came earlier than expected, dusting the valley with white overnight and heralding the approach of the mountain winter. Reed spent long days ensuring their preparations were complete, checking the livestock shelters, securing the woodpile, and hunting to add to their already substantial stores. Pearl threw herself into preserving the last of the garden's yield, rendering fat for candles and mending clothes that would need to last through the winter. The work was harder than anything she had done in Denver, but she found satisfaction in it that her previous life had never provided. One evening, as the first serious snowstorm howled around the cabin, Reed returned from a final check of the animals, stamping snow from his boots at the door. His face was red with cold, his breath visible in the air. "Everything's secure," he reported, hanging his coat to dry by the fire. "We're in for a proper storm tonight." Pearl handed him a cup of hot coffee laced with honey. "You're half frozen, come sit by the fire." As he warmed himself, Pearl noticed him wincing slightly when he moved his left hand. "Are you hurt?" Reed shook his head dismissively. "Just an old war injury that acts up in the cold. Nothing serious." "Let me see," she insisted, taking his hand in hers before he could object. The skin around his knuckles was red and swollen, the joints stiff. "You should have said something." Without waiting for his response, Pearl went to the kitchen and returned with a small jar of salve she had made from comfrey and beeswax. Sitting beside him on the settee, she applied the ointment to his hand, her touch gentle as she massaged it into his skin. Reed watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You've changed since you arrived," he observed quietly. Pearl looked up surprised. "Have I?" "You move differently, more confidently, and you've developed calluses." He turned her hands over in his, examining the hardened skin that had replaced the soft palms of a society lady. "Is that a criticism?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. Reed shook his head, a smile warming his features. "It's an admiration. Most city women would have been broken by the work here." "You've flourished." The sincerity in his voice made Pearl's cheeks warm. "I've had a good teacher." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Reed's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment Pearl thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently withdrew his hands from hers. "Thank you for the salve," he said, his voice slightly rough. "It helps." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. As they prepared for bed that night, Pearl found herself lingering in the main room, reluctant to retreat to her solitary bedroom. Reed stoked the fire one last time, his movements deliberate, as if he too were prolonging the moment. "Reed," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the quiet cabin. He straightened, turning to face her. "Yes." Pearl gathered her courage. "I've been thinking about our sleeping arrangements." His expression remained carefully neutral. "What about them?" "They seem unnecessary now. We are properly married after all." Reed took a step toward her, then stopped, his hands flexing at his sides. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," Pearl said, finding strength in the truth of her words. "I feel ready." The distance between them vanished as Reed closed the space in 2 long strides. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent as his thumbs traced the curves of her cheekbones. "I've wanted to be a proper husband to you since the day we married," he confessed, his voice low and intense. "But I needed you to come to it willingly, not out of duty." Pearl leaned into his touch, her heart racing. "It's not duty I feel, Reed." When his lips met hers, it was with a passion that had been building since their first tentative kiss on their wedding day. Pearl's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer as she responded with an eagerness that surprised them both. Later, in the warmth of their shared bed, with snow piling against the windows and the wind howling through the mountain passes, Pearl felt a sense of rightness that transcended her earlier fears. Reed's body against hers was strong yet gentle, his touches both protective and passionate. In his arms, her past failures seemed to melt away, replaced by a present filled with unexpected joy. As winter settled over the valley, Pearl and Reed settled into their new intimacy with a naturalness that belied their arranged beginning. The isolation that snow brought to their mountain home only strengthened their connection, giving them time and space to discover each other without outside distractions. Reed proved to be a thoughtful, considerate lover, attentive to Pearl's pleasure in ways Winston never had been. In turn, Pearl shed the rigid propriety that had been instilled in her, embracing the freedom to express her desires and affection openly. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity, tending livestock in the barn, maintaining the cabin, preserving their stores of food, and keeping paths clear through the deepening snow. Their nights were spent in shared warmth, conversations by firelight gradually giving way to more intimate exchanges. As December arrived, bringing with it the shortest days of the year, Pearl began to notice subtle changes in her body. Her breasts felt tender, and certain smells, particularly the coffee Reed brewed each morning, suddenly turned her stomach. She dismissed these signs at first, unwilling to nurture hope after years of disappointment. But when her monthly cycle failed to appear, she could no longer ignore the possibility. One morning, while Reed was out clearing snow from the barn roof, Pearl sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands pressed against her still flat abdomen, afraid to believe what her body was telling her. When Reed returned, stomping snow from his boots, he found her still sitting there, her expression distant. "Pearl," he asked, concern immediately evident in his voice, "are you unwell?" She looked up at him, tears gathering in her blue eyes. "I'm not certain, but I believe I might be with child." Reed went completely still, his green eyes widening. "Are you sure?" "Not entirely," she admitted, "but all the signs are there." He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "This is what you want, isn't it?" The question, asked with such genuine concern for her feelings rather than his own, made Pearl's heart swell with affection. "Yes," she whispered, "but I'm afraid to hope. After being told for so long that I couldn't." Reed brought her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll hope cautiously together." As the winter deepened, Pearl's condition became increasingly certain. The changes in her body were subtle but undeniable. Reed watched over her with protective attention, insisting she rest more and taking on additional chores despite her protests. "You're carrying our child," he said firmly when she objected to his coddling. "Nothing is more important than your well-being." Our child, the words filled Pearl with a happiness she had never expected to feel. Each morning she woke with her hand resting on her stomach, whispering silent prayers of gratitude and protection. January brought heavy snows that isolated them completely. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the town of Durango unreachable until spring. Reed kept busy with indoor projects, crafting a cradle from pine wood, repairing harnesses, and reading medical texts he had ordered months earlier, now studying the chapters on childbirth with intense concentration. "We should make plans," he said one evening as they sat before the fire, "for when the baby comes, we'll need supplies from town as soon as the pass is clear." Pearl smiled at his methodical approach. "The baby won't arrive until summer, Reed. We have time." "Still," he insisted, "I want to be prepared. Mrs. Thornton at the Mercantile might know of a midwife who could stay with us when the time comes." His concern touched Pearl deeply. Winston had shown no interest in the practical aspects of having children, viewing it merely as his wife's duty to produce an heir. Reed's active involvement in planning revealed a man who already saw himself as a father, not merely a progenitor. February brought a brief thaw, enough for Reed to venture to their nearest neighbor's homestead, the Wilkins family, who lived an hour's ride away. He returned with news of the outside world and, more importantly, confirmation that Mrs. Wilkins had experience as a midwife and would be willing to attend Pearl when her time came. "She says you should be eating more eggs and liver for strength," Reed reported, unpacking small gifts the neighbors had sent, knitted baby booties and a jar of preserved peaches. Pearl laughed, pressing a hand to her slightly rounded belly. "If I eat any more eggs, I'll start clucking. The chickens have been remarkably productive this winter." Reed's expression grew serious as he sat beside her on the settee. "Mrs. Wilkins also said, that is, she mentioned that sometimes women who were thought to be barren end up having more than one baby at once, twins or even triplets," Pearl finished, her eyes widening. "She said it happens sometimes when the body has been holding back." Reed looked slightly embarrassed by this folk wisdom, probably just an old wives' tale. Pearl considered this, running her hand over the small swell of her abdomen. "It doesn't feel like more than one, but I suppose we won't know until summer." As March arrived, bringing longer days and the first hints of spring, Pearl's pregnancy became more pronounced. Her slender frame now showed a definite roundness, and the baby, or babies, had begun to move, little flutters that never failed to bring tears of joy to her eyes. The snow began to melt, revealing the dormant land beneath. Reed spent long days outside, repairing winter damage to fences and outbuildings, preparing fields for planting, and checking on wild animals returning to the valley. Pearl found herself drawing more, sketching the changing landscape and planning a series of illustrations of the homestead through the seasons. Sometimes she would catch Reed watching her with a soft expression that made her heart skip. "What are you thinking when you look at me that way?" she asked him one afternoon as she sat sketching by the window. Reed leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. I'm thinking about how different my life would be if your father hadn't written to me, how this house would still be just a shelter, not a home. Pearl set down her charcoal. Do you ever regret agreeing to marry a stranger? Not for a single moment, he said without hesitation. Do you? She shook her head, smiling. It seems impossible that I once thought being sent here was a punishment. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. April brought renewal to the valley, wildflowers blooming in meadows, trees budding with fresh green, and the river running high with snowmelt. Pearl's belly grew rounder, her body changing to accommodate the new life within. Reed insisted on accompanying her on her walks, ever vigilant for her safety as the local wildlife became more active. One morning, as Pearl was gathering eggs from the henhouse, she felt a strange sensation, a tightening across her abdomen followed by a sharp pain that took her breath away. She gripped the edge of the nesting box, waiting for it to pass. When Reed found her minutes later, still standing frozen in the henhouse, he immediately knew something was wrong. Pearl, what is it? I had a pain, she admitted, her voice tight with fear, like a cramp but stronger. Reed's face paled. The baby isn't coming. It can't be, Pearl said, shaking her head. It's too early, not until summer. Another pain seized her and she gasped, clutching her belly. Reed swept her into his arms without hesitation, carrying her back to the house with long, urgent strides. I'm getting Mrs. Wilkins, he said as he settled her on their bed. Would you be all right alone for an hour? Pearl nodded, fighting her fear. I think it was just a false alarm. Women have those, don't they? Reed pressed a kiss to her forehead. Let's make sure. I'll be back as quickly as I can. The hour of Reed's absence stretched interminably for Pearl. The pains came at irregular intervals, sometimes sharp, sometimes merely uncomfortable. She tried to recall what little she knew of childbirth, gleaned from hushed conversations among married women in Denver drawing rooms. When Reed finally returned with Mrs. Wilkins, Pearl had convinced herself that her fears were unfounded. The older woman, a sturdy, practical frontier wife with graying hair and kind eyes, examined Pearl with experienced hands. These are practice pains, she announced after her examination, the body preparing itself. Not unusual, especially for a first pregnancy. Relief washed over Pearl, so the baby is safe. Mrs. Wilkins patted her hand reassuringly. Perfectly safe, but I do think you're carrying more than one, my dear. The size and the way they're moving, I'd wager twins at least. Reed, who had been pacing anxiously near the door, stopped abruptly. Twins. My mother was a twin, Pearl said softly, remembering stories her grandmother had told. I never thought. Mrs. Wilkins stayed for dinner, providing practical advice about the remainder of Pearl's pregnancy and what to expect during delivery. When she left, promising to check on Pearl regularly as her time approached, Reed and Pearl sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Twins, Reed said again, the word both hopeful and daunting. We'll need to expand the nursery space. Pearl leaned against his shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence. I never imagined having even one child after being told so often that I couldn't, and now perhaps two. Reed's arm tightened around her. Denver doctors clearly don't know everything they claim to. As May turned to June, Pearl's pregnancy progressed without further alarms. Her belly grew impressively, supporting Mrs. Wilkins' theory about multiple babies. Reed completed work on a second cradle and expanded their store of baby linens, riding to Durango twice for supplies now that the mountain passes were clear. The circuit preacher, Reverend Miller, passed through again, marveling at the change in Pearl's circumstances since he had married them the previous autumn. God works in mysterious ways, he observed as he blessed the expectant mother. What man declares impossible, the Lord often proves otherwise. The summer heat arrived in July, making Pearl uncomfortable as she entered what should have been her final month of pregnancy. Mrs. Wilkins visited more frequently, assuring Pearl that everything was progressing normally, if somewhat more dramatically due to the multiple babies. Twins often come a bit early, she advised. Be prepared for them by the end of the month rather than August. Reed took this advice to heart, rarely venturing far from the homestead despite the pressing work of summer. He arranged for a young man from a neighboring ranch to help with the haying, allowing him to remain close to the house. The babies, however, had their own schedule. On a sweltering afternoon in mid-July, as Pearl rested in the shade of the porch, her water broke with a sudden gush. "Reed," she called, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. "It's time." What followed was 18 hours of the most demanding work Pearl had ever experienced. Mrs. Wilkins arrived within 2 hours, taking charge with calm efficiency. Reed remained by Pearl's side throughout, supporting her, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement as labor progressed. The first baby, a boy with a strong cry and a shock of dark hair, arrived just after midnight. Pearl had barely time to hold him before the contractions began again in earnest. "Another one coming," Mrs. Wilkins announced, taking the newborn to clean and swaddle him. The second baby, a girl with delicate features and Reed's green eyes, arrived 30 minutes later, her cry softer but no less healthy than her brother's. Pearl, exhausted but elated, thought her ordeal was complete. Then Mrs. Wilkins, checking her abdomen, looked up with surprise. "There's another one," she said, her voice reflecting her astonishment. "Triplets." Reed, who had been cradling his newborn daughter, looked up sharply. "Three." The third baby, another boy, smaller than his siblings but with a surprisingly lusty cry, made his appearance just before dawn. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the valley in golden light, Pearl lay in her bed surrounded by her three newborns, a miracle she had never dared to imagine. Reed sat beside her, his face showing a mixture of wonder, pride, and lingering concern. "Three babies," he said softly. "You've given me 3 children in one day." Pearl touched each tiny head in turn, dark-haired Thomas, green-eyed Elizabeth, and small but fierce James. "Not barren after all," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I never believed you were," Reed said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "From the moment you arrived, I saw only possibility in you." Mrs. Wilkins, who had been cleaning up after the delivery, paused in the doorway. "I've seen many births in my time," she said, "but never triplets that all lived and thrived. You have a special blessing here." As summer faded into autumn, the young family adjusted to their suddenly expanded household. The triplets, against all odds in an era when multiple births often meant tragedy, continued to thrive. Pearl recovered her strength gradually, assisted by Reed's unwavering support and occasional help from neighboring women who came to marvel at the 3 babies and lend a hand. Pearl wrote to her parents in Denver, informing them of the births and enclosing a sketch she had made of the 3 infants. The response, when it finally came, was a letter from her mother expressing cautious congratulations and suggesting that perhaps the Denver doctors had been mistaken in their assessment. "No mention of visiting their grandchildren," Reed observed as Pearl read the letter aloud. "Does that disappoint you?" Pearl looked up from where she sat nursing Elizabeth while the boys slept nearby. "Strangely, no. This is our family now, you, me, and these 3. I don't need their approval anymore." The realization was liberating. The false belief that had been planted in her, that her worth was measured by her ability to bear children, had not only been proven wrong but had been replaced by a deeper truth. That love, not biology, was what truly mattered. Reed had seen her value long before her body had produced these 3 miracles. As winter approached once more, Reed completed an addition to the cabin, a larger bedroom for them and a nursery for the triplets. On the evening they moved the babies into their new room, with its 3 cradles arranged beneath a window that would someday frame the mountain view. Reed took Pearl's hand. "I have something for you," he said, leading her to his workshop. Inside, covered with a cloth, stood an easel and a set of painting supplies, oils, brushes, and canvases he had ordered from Denver. "I thought you might want to paint the children," he explained, "and the valley. Your drawings are beautiful, but color would capture it even better." Pearl touched the brushes reverently, overcome by his thoughtfulness. "How did you know I've always wanted to paint?" "You mentioned it once when you were telling me about your art lessons. Said the teacher thought you had talent for oils but your father wouldn't pay for the supplies." Reed shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I remembered." Pearl turned to him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. You really listen when I speak." "Of course I do," he said simply. "You're my wife. Your thoughts matter to me." In that moment, with the sound of their babies sleeping nearby and the mountains standing sentinel outside, Pearl felt the full measure of how far she had come. From a disgraced barren wife sent away in shame to a stranger, to a mother of three, loved and valued by a man who saw her true worth. "I love you, Reed Young," she said, speaking the words aloud for the first time, though they had been growing in her heart for months. Reed gathered her in his arms, his green eyes warm with answering emotion. "And I love you, Pearl Young, have since somewhere between our wedding day and the first snowfall." As they sealed this declaration with a kiss, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that what had begun as her parents' punishment had become her greatest blessing. In sending her to this mountain man, they had unknowingly given her everything she had ever truly wanted: love, family, and a place to belong. The triplets' first birthday arrived the following summer, marked by a celebration that brought together the scattered neighbors from miles around. As Pearl watched Reed tossing little Thomas in the air, his laughter mingling with the child's delighted squeals, she felt a contentment that transcended anything she had known in her previous life. Elizabeth and James crawled in the grass nearby, supervised by Mrs. Wilkins, who had become like a grandmother to the children. The valley bloomed around them, the homestead now expanded to include a larger barn, more livestock, and fields that produced bountifully under Reed's careful stewardship. "Your father would never believe this," said a voice beside her. Pearl turned to find her mother standing there, looking both out of place in her fine Denver clothing and strangely diminished against the backdrop of the mountains. Elizabeth had arrived unannounced that morning, claiming a desire to finally meet her grandchildren. "No, he wouldn't," Pearl agreed, watching as Reed now balanced James on his shoulders. "He thought he was sending me to punishment and isolation. Instead, he gave me freedom." Her mother studied the scene before them with an expression Pearl couldn't quite read. "You've changed, Pearl, you're stronger now." "I found my place," Pearl said simply, "and a man who sees me as I am, not as what society expects me to be." Elizabeth Kearney smoothed her skirts, a nervous gesture Pearl remembered from childhood. "Your father sends his regards. He's too proud to come himself, but he asked me to see how you were faring." "You can tell him I'm faring very well indeed," Pearl replied, no bitterness in her voice, only the calm assurance of a woman who had found her true home. "Better than I ever would have in Denver." As her mother departed the next day, promising to visit again though both women knew she likely wouldn't, Pearl stood on the porch of the cabin, their home, with Reed beside her and their three children nearby. The valley stretched before them and the mountains stood eternal in the distance. "Any regrets?" Reed asked quietly, his arm around her waist. Pearl leaned against him, watching Thomas take wobbly steps toward his siblings. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." The path that had brought her here, from disgrace and rejection to love and abundance, seemed, in retrospect, the only one that could have led her home. Her parents had sent her to a mountain man for being barren, and he had made her the mother of triplets. But more importantly, he had helped her discover her own worth beyond society's narrow definitions, beyond her ability to bear children, beyond everything she had once believed about herself. In the golden light of the mountain afternoon, Pearl Young gathered her family close and gave thanks for the journey that had seemed like exile but had proven to be salvation.